Hey, it's Rachel Cooke, your modern mentor. I'm the founder of Lead Above Noise. We work with leaders and teams to build capability and confidence, to lead through change, and to drive their best results while keeping burnout at bay. And we'd love to partner with your team. Shoot me a note at rachel@leadabovenoise.com. We can book a chat. So today, friends, you are in for a super treat. Because today I get to share with you a conversation I've dreamed of having for quite some time. And, well, serendipity was on my side, and I got to meet the illustrious, wise, and delightful AJ Jacobs. If you're not familiar with AJ, he's been someone I've followed and admired for at least a decade. He is, in my very humble opinion, the master of all things curious and quirky and wise. So much so, he's made a career out of these traits. And I just wanted to learn more about how he's managed to do so, how he's had the courage to follow whimsy, how he's been resilient enough to pursue ideas that on the surface did not scream success, and how we can all infuse more of these ways of being and doing into our everyday work experiences. We talk about following curiosity, about being brave and resilient, and so much more. I hope you enjoy. Okay, AJ Jacobs, author, podcaster extraordinaire. Welcome to the Modern Mentor Podcast. I am so over the moon to have you here today.
I am over the moon to be here. I am a fan. I am a big fan. I love your podcast, and it's got these actionable tips that I take away every time. So I'm feeling stressed. I need to give some actionable tips to the listeners so they can come away and be like, oh, there are 4 things I can do. So that's my goal. I'm stating it here.
All right. We have set the bar high. They've got to be actionable. They got to be quick. They got to be dirty. We're going to make this happen. So AJ, just quick background for the listeners. You and I had the great fortune, and by great fortune, I mean all mine, to meet in person a few weeks ago. It turns out randomly, we are sending our children off to college together. I saw your name on a guest list, and I said to my husband, I am going to meet this guy, and I'm going to get him on my show, because I have been a fan of his for definitely at least a decade at this point. So I am so excited that you're here. And for fans that don't know you, I described you as an author, and you are, by the letter of the law. But I would also say that there is very little traditional about the way that you author. How would you describe what you do for a living?
Yeah, well, first, I was so thrilled that our kids are both going to the same college. I don't know if there's a term for that are like relatives, like mishpucha or something. But it was great to meet you in person. And as for your question, people have described what I do as method writing, which I like. A method, sort of like method acting. So what I do is I immerse myself in a topic, and then I live it for a year or more, maybe less, and then I write about what I've learned. So I've done that with several topics, everything from religion. I tried to follow the Bible as literally as possible for a year. I tried to be the healthiest person for a year. I tried to be the most grateful person for a year, which I think we have many overlaps in the way we think, but one of them is gratitude. And I also became the most obsessive puzzle solver for a year, jigsaws, crosswords, etc. So I love it. I love my job, and I feel lucky that I can do it, and that enough people buy my books that I can continue doing it.
Well, I will keep ranting and raving about them.
Hopefully more raving than ranting.
More raving, noted. More raving than ranting. Okay. So I have described you to people, to my friends, as kind of a blend between a very happy, grateful Larry David and Christopher Guest, the movie director, method acting or method writing, because I feel like what you do in your books, and we're going to talk about it a little bit in a minute, is you go really, really deep into something. For anyone who's ever seen a Christopher Guest movie, he sort of does something similar where he goes into the world of like people bringing their dogs to dog shows, or he goes into this really narrow slice of the world and he highlights all of the quirks that are in there that nobody's ever looked at that closely. and he helps you see the levity and the humor, but not at anybody's expense. And I kind of feel like that's a little bit of what I have experienced you doing with your books. I think the first one that I read was called Drop Dead Healthy. And it was fascinating because you spoke to all of these experts across
Right.
the entire health spectrum. I remember there was one doctor who had never washed his hands ever, and another one who washed her hands after literally every exchange. And you're trying to figure out kind of what's what here.
First, I just love that description. I love both Christopher Guest and Larry David. I talk about in the gratitude book that I feel that in my mind, it's always a battle between Larry David and Mr. Rogers. You've got the positive side and the negative side. That's how and I do try. I love watching Larry David, but I don't want to be Larry David. So I always try to bulk up my grateful side. But yeah, I also love what you say about, I like to be the everyman and try to learn everything, and talk to all these experts and then try to bring back what I think is the wisdom to the reader.
That is amazing. Now, my first question for you is, how do you find your ideas? And by the way, just to take a step back and give this some context, the reason I really wanted to talk to you today, AJ, is, well, because we had so much fun at our college event, but more so because I'm just talking to people all over the place across industries who are really struggling at work right now. They are bored, they are disconnected, they are lonely, they feel stuck. There's a lot of, they are burned out, they are overwhelmed. And I feel like people are struggling to find their spark these days. That's what I feel like I'm hearing over and over. And you are like a walking spark plug. And so at least that's my experience of you. And so that is really what I want to explore with you today. I want to talk about your relationship with creativity and whimsy and risk taking, because I feel like these are some of the missing elements that people are struggling to find. So I probably should have done that setup in the beginning, but I'm doing it now. Better late than never. So with that said, I would love to hear a little bit from you about where your ideas come from. Like, we're all walking down the same streets, but you just seem to see things, or your eye seems to get caught by things that other people's don't. And I'm curious what you can share about that.
Well, I can share that I love coming up with ideas, and I will say that 98% of my ideas are terrible. Yeah, they're just crap. So hopefully you see the 2% that are good, but know that it is just the tip of an iceberg where most of the ideas are terrible. I tried to be very disciplined about it. So I do spend 15 minutes every morning with my remarkable tablet, writing by hand, because I am a fan of writing by hand. And I have some magazines around me, and I come up with ideas. And as I say, most of them are terrible. I've opened up my list of ideas. I have a list of thousands of ideas, good and bad. And I'll just read you, and you can see most of them. I'll read like 4 or 5, and you'll see. I saw a picture of Mona Lisa, and I thought, well, what if Mona Lisa came alive? They made a movie about, it's like Splash with the mermaid, but Mona Lisa comes out of the frame. I don't think that's a great movie idea, but it was interesting. I enjoyed coming up with it. I was thinking about meat that you can make in a laboratory, and now there's no boundaries. So what if you took a little meat from every species on Earth, a little cheek swab, and you had an everything burger, like an everything bagel. So yes, your face is making, and you are looking absolutely grossed out, which is the point. As I say, most of these are bad ideas. We're never going to. But then I thought, sometimes they lead to something. Like, for instance, I was thinking, I don't know, I saw a picture of a cat, and I thought of the word catty. And are cats actually catty? And that led to a puzzle that I'm going to do on my podcast, which is about puzzles, about adjectives and verbs related to animals. So that idea, it was just a seed that planted something. It may not be the greatest puzzle ever, but I thought it was interesting enough to pursue. So that is, I come up to me, and I've talked to creativity experts because I've written about creativity, and And the general consensus among the scientists is it's a numbers game. You don't see a lot of Picasso's terrible stuff, but he made it. He made terrible stuff and he might have given it away. So it is a lot about being okay with coming up with bad ideas because that's the only way you're going to get to the good ideas.
Okay. So that's really helpful. And I actually, in the spirit of making sure we capture actionable tips, I kind of feel like I heard two in there. So keep me honest. One thing I heard you say is it's about volume, right? So sitting and thinking and waiting for the good idea to rise to the top is probably a losing person's game. And I have heard, I think it was Seth Godin who said the people with the most good ideas are just the ones with the most bad ideas, right? So
love that.
There's definitely something about just generating volume and letting it flow. I love that you have that daily practice. But I also heard, and maybe I am intuiting this and you can call me out and say that it's wrong. But what I hear you saying is you're not necessarily thinking of ideas in service of something. You're just thinking of stuff. Like you're just letting ideas come. You're not necessarily, it doesn't sound like you were trying to come up with a puzzle. You were just letting ideas come out and be what they need to be. And you turned one of them into a puzzle, right? And so from a creativity standpoint, I feel like discipline and volume is one thing. And then what I'm hearing is there doesn't have to be a purpose or a so what to it. It's just a creative exercise. Is that any of that fair and reasonable?
Not just fair, but super insightful. Thank you for that. Yes, I think there's room for both. I think sometimes when I'm in the morning, I am just sort of coming up with ideas, and then later I'm saying, could this be an article? Could this be a Substack? Could this be a book or a puzzle? Sometimes I am more focused and say, okay, I need to come up with a book idea. Let's spend the next half hour on that. But again, it is a lot about the discipline, which you mentioned, and carving out a half hour, making an appointment with your creative self, as some people say. A little cheesy, but there you go. Like you do have to. So that's not true for everyone. Some people get their best ideas in the shower, and I've heard scientists talk about how that releases the frontal cortex to let you make connections. Honestly, for me, it is much more productive to do the half hour. And no, even like that first 5 minutes, you may not get anything good because you got to let your brain warm up. And then the other question, which I think you implied, but was how do I know which ideas are good? And that is very tricky. I'd say I have 2 or 3 heuristics that I really rely on. One is, does this idea stick around in my brain for a couple of months? And I'm thinking, oh, remember that idea? That was actually interesting. And I do like to tell my ideas, good and bad, to people so I can see their reaction. So I saw your reaction to the everything burger, so I know not to pursue that. But if you can tell, friends will often say, oh, that's a good idea, but you can kind of see it in their eyes whether they really believe it or not.
I love that. So making good use of the people around you, the people that you know and trust, and maybe some new people. I know the first time you and I met, you shared an idea with me, and I think I gave you an honest reaction. I do tend to do that. And I thought it was really cool that you did that. Honestly, in the moment, I felt honored, and now I'm pretty sure that you just do that with everybody. But still, I think it's a great technique, right? There's no reason to keep everything so close to the vest. The people around you are resources. So tap into it.
Yeah, well, Awesome. It's interesting. I used to play it very close to the vest, not share my ideas, because there is a risk that someone else will take the idea. So there. Mm-hmm. And in some industries, that's a bigger risk than others. I have found over the years that the benefits of sharing ideas even in the infant stage, outweighs the risks. And I've seen this. This is an example from many years ago, but my friend was on Facebook and he posted, I wish there was a book called Go the F to Sleep. Or he said, I'm writing a book. He said it jokingly. And everyone on his Facebook feed was like, that's a great idea. You should really do that. And that became the book, which sold millions of copies. It was called Go the F to Sleep. But The F was spelled out. And it was a great way to
Yeah.
humorously address the frustration of trying to get kids to sleep.
That book was brilliant, and it really carried me through some of the early years when, yes, I remember the pain. That's so interesting. I love that. Thank you. So obviously, or maybe not obviously, but a lot of my listeners are living in professional worlds that are probably a bit different to yours. It sounds like you're working in a space where you have the liberty, maybe also the curse of, but certainly the liberty of the space to be creative, and you have some freedom around that. And yet, to your point, books are business, your work is business. And so how do you kind of find that balance between being creative and letting your imagination roam, but also thinking about maybe the commercial value of an idea, and creating the discipline to actually sit down and write the book or do the work? Any tips in that realm you
Oh,
can
yeah.
share with us?
Well, one thing that comes to mind is trying not to say, oh, this is a creative job and this is a non-creative job. So, for instance, I went into writing because I thought, I love to write, which is not actually true. I don't like to write. The actual writing sitting alone is quite unpleasant. Coming up with ideas, talking about those ideas, researching, that I do find enjoyable. But I was always afraid of marketing. But then I had to reframe it. A few years ago, I was like, this is a huge part of being a writer, is the marketing. So I'm going to reframe it as something creative instead of this chore that I dread. And that made a huge difference. And I was able to, I realized you can be incredibly creative in marketing. And so when I wrote the book about the Bible, where I lived by every rule in the Bible, from the 10 Commandments on down to growing a huge beard, that came out, and I said, all right, well, how can I reach those markets that normally wouldn't be interested in this book? And the Bible talks about sex. There's a lot of sex in the Bible. Then the Song of Songs, the Song of Solomon, is quite racy. So I did an article. I pitched a Glamour magazine, which it's still pretty big, but at the time was much bigger. I said, what if I wrote an article, sex tips from the Bible? And they said, yeah, that's great. We'll do it. So I was able to get that. And then I did the same thing, business tips from the Bible. And I was able to market it to both atheists and religious people, because the book was about how there are good parts to religion and bad parts to religion. So for those who wanted to focus on the skepticism, I was there. For those who wanted to look at the good parts, I was there. And that was super fun and creative. So I think that's it. A lot about framing and focusing on how anything can be creative if you look at it a certain way.
I love that. So in the context of the work that I do, so I have my background is in organizational psychology, and there is this concept that we talk about in the workplace called job crafting, which is really just kind of a nerdy, wonky way of giving terminology to what you just described, right? I think the analog in the more traditional workplace is that, when you have a job, there are certain objectives you need to achieve. There are certain outcomes you need to get to, but finding the activities that give you joy, that light you up, thinking about your job through a particular lens or context can really shift your experience of it, right? And so I think there's something really powerful in that. If you are a person who is a great talker and a great connector and a great researcher, you can really harness that and leverage that. If you're somebody who loves spreadsheets, you can always find a way to choose the activities that give you joy and find a way to bring them into the path of delivering an outcome that you are accountable to.
Great point. I love that insight.
Yeah. And so you gave us such a great example of that, because I can appreciate that. The idea of marketing a book, if you're a writer, if you're a creative, marketing sounds like a very kind of wonky discipline, and there are right ways and wrong ways. And it sounds like there's a lot of rigor, and you kind of brought your own strengths into how you approached it. And I will say you've been very successful just by the measure of, I definitely fall into more of the atheist bucket. And I read that book and I loved it. And I thought it was hilarious. And I couldn't wait to meet your wife because she is definitely the hero of it, as we have discussed. I couldn't imagine having had to live with you through that year-long experiment, but she did it.
She is very
Amazing.
patient.
Thank you for that. Thank you for sharing that. Here's what I would love to ask you next. So you've talked a little bit about how you love coming up with ideas, how you have discipline around coming up with ideas. Maybe for people who are feeling a little bit of like boredom and monotony and my job just kind of feels the same every day, is there anything that you do to just kind of like whet your appetite for curiosity? Any tips on how to start to build that muscle?
I love that question. And I would say, yeah, to make curiosity and gratitude are sort of my two favorite human drives or emotions. And yeah, there are ways to build up both. One of the ways I find is I once interviewed Alex Trebek, the late host of Jeopardy, because I was working at Esquire magazine. I loved him. By the way, he cursed like a sailor off screen. So there you go. But still quite lovable. And one of the quotes he said, I still think about it because it's a little paradoxical, but I totally got it. And he said, I'm curious about everything, even those things that don't interest me. I'm curious about everything, even those things that don't interest me. And what I think he meant is it's a way of looking at the world and realizing that those topics that might on the surface seem dull are actually almost always fascinating because they almost always deal with human life. So when I was writing that book on coffee, I had to do a section on logistics, how the coffee gets to me. And I had never thought about pallets, those wooden sort of crates and I was like, how am I going to write even a sentence on that? But once I started looking into it, I read a quote, the world runs on pallets. So everything I'm looking at right now, this microphone, this computer, this table, has been on a pallet. So without pallets, I would have nothing. So you've got to look.
That's a fun fact.
There are billions of them. 80% of merchandise has been on a pallet. And without it, so I always say, how does it affect humans? I mean, things can be interesting on their own, but it affects my life in a huge way, and I never even think about it. So then I have some sort of emotional, personal investment in it. I'm like, I'm thankful for pallets. Without them, I wouldn't be talking to you. I wouldn't have my morning coffee. And that, I think, is one way to pique your curiosity. See, how does it affect my life? Because we're so interconnected that almost everything does affect our lives, whether that's accounting, which is seemingly people make fun of it for being boring, or even I've heard podcasts about concrete and how important concrete is to the world. It's like, I think it's perhaps the most common manufactured substance. And I wouldn't be sitting here without it. So how does it affect your life? And then going from there, I think that's an entry point to pique your curiosity.
I love that. That's such a different way of looking at things. And I think sometimes in the workplace, sometimes the question that can really trigger for people is, how does this affect the customer or the patient, depending on what kind of business we're in? Depending on what function you're in. I think if you're in a healthcare organization and you are a physician, if you're a nurse, how you affect the patient is pretty obvious. But if you work in finance, if you work on the janitorial staff, sometimes having some curiosity about how a task that you have to manage in your day will ultimately have that impact might be a way to sort of leverage that principle in a different context. I love that.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Of course, thank you. I mean, there's this famous story I think I wrote about in the gratitude book that turns out to be true. It sounds apocryphal, but it's true, that John F. Kennedy was touring NASA and he asked a janitor who was mopping the hall, and he said, "What's your job here?" And he said, "My job is to help put a man on the moon." And I was like, well, that is such a great reframe, and really, yeah, quite inspiring. The other reframe I love is, as you know, I love my puzzles. So I love a quote from Quincy Jones, who's the music producer, who says, his philosophy of life, he just died, rest in peace. He said, "I don't have problems, I have puzzles." So he said, when you look at life, try to see it as a puzzle at work, in your relationships, because it's so much more invigorating and empowering. A problem or a crisis makes you want to curl up in the corner, but a puzzle, you're like, okay, let's roll up our sleeves and see how we can solve this.
I love that. I'm going to have to look that one up. Thank you.
Of course.
Okay. So here is my next question for you. I would describe you, I've already described you a lot, I know, but I would describe you as somebody who presents with this really interesting balance of humility and almost a bit of like self-deprecation. And yet I have to imagine it takes a lot of confidence to be doing what you do, to be pitching ideas, to be pitching Glamour magazine, to write an article about sex from the Bible. How do you do that? How do you, first of all, does that resonate with you? And second of all, if you're willing to accept my description, how do you strike that balance of being humble and being able to laugh at yourself, but being able to channel the confidence to take these risks and put these ideas out there?
Yeah, well, I would say it is accurate with an asterisk. I act as if I'm confident, but really, often I'm not. But I think we talked about this. I am a big fan of how behavior shapes your emotions, how the outer shapes your inner, the whole idea of acting as if, and fake it till you feel it. Not just fake it till you make it, but fake it till it actually starts to resonate with you. And that's an ancient idea that's been around for thousands of years, but it's also a modern idea because a lot of cognitive behavioral psychology, which I'm a big fan of, rests on this idea. So I will pretend that I'm confident until I become a little more confident. So, for instance, you mentioned the health book. I had to call sort of the top doctors and experts on health in the world. And I was like, who am I? I don't have a PhD. And so I would wake up sometimes despairing. This topic is too big. But I would act as if I were confident. And I would call up my publisher. I'd say, now when this is published, let's have a big party where we serve kale martinis. And, I had all these. So I would act as if I was confident that this was going to be a mega hit. And that gave, eventually, after a couple of hours every day, I found I had to restart it every day. And I would eventually become more confident and have the confidence to call up anyone in the world. And also be okay with being rejected. That's part of it. So yes, I do feel you need confidence, but you can sort of fake that confidence until you gain the real confidence.
Okay, that's helpful. It takes a lot of reps.
Yeah. I think it's also the same with gratitude. I would wake up and I would be in my Larry David mood of not being grateful, but I would force myself to call people or meet people and say how thankful I was. And eventually it would sink in. Your brain catches up with your behavior.
So can we talk a little bit about your experience with gratitude?
Of course.
You've written about it. You've talked about it a lot. It's a concept that I think has become pretty popular in pop culture these days. What would you say was most surprising to you as you started kind of forcing yourself to be mindful of moments of gratitude? What surprised you? What did you learn about yourself?
Well, a lot. One thing was, I think the quote is from a Benedictine monk, but and he said, happiness does not lead to gratitude. Gratitude leads to happiness. And I really felt that because when I forced myself to be grateful, I actually was, I would become happier. And I'll give you just one example of this. The idea of the book was to call or thank in person every single person, not every single, 1,000 people who had anything to do with making my morning cup of coffee. So that meant the obvious, like the barista. I flew to South America and I thanked the farmers of the beans, but I also thanked the truck driver and who carried the coffee beans, or the people who made the road for the truck driver because he couldn't have done it. So the idea was it's all interconnected. And I remember one day calling the woman who did pest control for the warehouse where the coffee beans were stored. And I said, I know this is a strange call, but I'd like to thank you for helping to keep the insects out of my coffee. And she said, well, that is a little weird, but thank you. I don't get a lot of positive feedback in my line of work, and this has kind of made my day, which in turn made my day. So it was this virtuous cycle where you actually become happier by thanking other people. And that was a huge lesson.
That's amazing. It's amazing. And, one of the conversations I have often in the workplace is around recognition programs, right? And we need to have an online platform, and we need funding, and we need to be able to, give people money and spot bonuses, and all that is great. And I tell organizations, if you can manage that, if you have the time and the funds, go for it. But really just regular, authentic expressions of thank you. And I like to tell people, not just thank you for the heroes, and not just thank you for the big wins, but thank you for just behaviors that you appreciate, that you want to see repeated. Expressing gratitude to somebody because they poked a hole in your plan when nobody else had the courage to do it, right? Or somebody gave you a piece of advice that you didn't ask for. Like, the things that we thank people for, they want to repeat, right? And to your point about that virtuous cycle, it sort of, you say thank you, it triggers dopamine in the other person. They want to do it again, and then they want to say thank you. And so, I think for anybody who's not feeling appreciated or recognized in their own lives, they should be mindful of how can you express that gratitude and recognize somebody else. And you should start the practice and create a little bit of a positive contagion around that.
That is such a great point. Yeah, if you aren't feeling recognized, maybe recognize other people, and they'll get the idea that this is a good thing. Yeah, that's great.
So I want to switch gears, AJ, and I want to just talk a little bit about your podcast, because like everything else you touch, it's a little quirky and it's super fun. Can you tell us a little about it and what triggered you to start it?
Of course. It's called The Puzzler with AJ Jacobs. It's on iHeart, and it's every day a short little burst of audio puzzle, sort of like Wordle for your ears. And I did it because I wrote a book, as I mentioned, on puzzles. And I do think that puzzles are not a waste of time. Maybe that is rationalization on my part, but I genuinely think, like Quincy Jones says, treat your life like a puzzle, and it's better. And it's all about curiosity, all about solutions, which I think we need to have a solution mindset instead of a problem mindset. So I'm a huge fan of puzzles, and we'll have on celebrities. Often they're celebrities in quotes, but sometimes real celebrities, like Joseph Gordon-Levitt is coming up next week, and he's a real celebrity. Yeah. And audio puzzles that are meant to just keep you sharp and get your brain going in the morning or at night whenever you listen. And I'll give you a couple of quick examples so that it makes more sense. One is this puzzle we came up with where it is, I give a hint of a word. I'm going to say a word, but it is a clue to a 2-word phrase. And you've got to figure out what that 2-word phrase is by the way that I say the first word. So, for instance, if I say tide, then that answer is going to be rising tide, because they said it in a rising way. So if I said, for instance, like take over, then that is a
Hostile.
clue to,
Hostile
oh yeah,
takeover.
you are good. That
I
was
really am.
fast. I forget. Are you a puzzler? Do you like puzzles?
I do now.
Great. But another one is banana. Banana.
Split. Banana
But
split.
wow.
I
And what
know.
I love is I saw the aha moment in your eyes. You were like puzzled and then you got it. And that's what we're going for. So I do love it. And as I say, I do think puzzles are not a waste of time. They're the opposite. They are a very important way to look at the world.
I completely agree. And coming back to this whole idea of creativity, I am a really big believer in the power of just engaging different parts of our brains throughout the day, right? I'm a big believer in, I love reading. I read a lot of nonfiction. I read a lot of
Thank
business,
you.
but I read a lot of fiction. And I think that there's power in that. And I have not listened to a podcast about concrete, but I do try to listen to things that are kind of out of my comfort zone, not necessarily things that I'm listening to specifically to learn something, but just to engage parts of my brain that I wouldn't necessarily engage otherwise. I just think the more spots we can light up, the more interesting ideas and the more captivating connections I think we can make throughout a day. That's my hot take.
100%. You and I are exactly aligned on that. Yeah, reading books about things that you know nothing about and you might not even be interested in. And also reading articles. I mean, that is one of the dangers that a lot of thinkers have been talking about for years, is that the way the internet works is it figures out what you like and gives you more and more of that. Whereas in the old days, which were not perfect, I don't want to say we got to go back, but there was more serendipity in our media. So if you were looking at the paper and reading about something you're interested in, whatever that is, finance, maybe on that same page there was an article about India, and you would never get that on your feed, but you'd say like, oh, this is interesting, and it expanded your mind. So I try to do that in my information intake, is to not just focus on things I agree with or that I'm immediately interested in.
I think that is really good advice right now in and outside of the workplace. I think we all need to be mindful of not getting stuck in our own bubbles and just
Right.
keeping our minds open broadly.
100%. I use this app called Ground News, and it has this feature called Blind Spot, and it'll show, and I don't think the world can be divided into just conservative and liberal. I think but for the purposes of this app, they do classify certain magazines, media as liberal and some as conservative, and they'll show you what the conservative media is covering that is a blind spot for the liberals, and they'll show you what the liberal media is covering that's a blind spot for the conservatives. And I find it very helpful to just have more of a finger on the pulse of what is going on, not just in my bubble, but everywhere.
That is so interesting. I'm going to download that. So thank you for that, Rack.
Of course, Ground News.
All right, I'm getting in there. So AJ, I want to be respectful of your time. This has been so much fun for me. Thank you.
Loving it.
I want to ask this one last question. And this comes from a place. So obviously, like I said, you and I are getting ready to launch some kids, send them to college. And I'm in this season right now because I've had experience in HR. A lot of my friends are coming to me with concerns and anxiety. Oh, my kid wants to study music. My kid wants to study this. It's so impractical. I need them to study business. I need them to study, this Renaissance poetry. This is crazy. I have some really strong perspective on that, but I would love to get yours. So, you and I have talked. I know you've got 3 kids. You and your wife have what I can only describe as some pretty unconventional career paths. You both do some really interesting things. And I'm curious, as you think about your kids as they're growing up and them having watched you both of you navigate these very interesting career paths, what do you hope? What do you hope they've seen? What do you hope they've taken away from watching the two of you do what you've done?
Well, thank you for that. First of all, before we go, I do want to hear some of your insights on this question. But I will say a couple of things. One is, yes, my wife, by the way, just for context, she has a company that puts on scavenger hunts for team building. So you talked about whimsy and how whimsy can be helpful in business. And so that's sort of the premise of her. They do these scavenger hunts in museums and neighborhoods where you answer fun questions and it's team building. But yes, we both have slightly unusual. We both work very hard. I mean, I am working maybe too much. That is, I don't. But when my kids, I will say, when my kids are there and want to do something with me, whatever time of day it is, I put the work away and I focus. So I do hope that that's a lesson that they take away, is to be fully present in whatever you're doing, whether that's being fully present while working or being fully present in your relationships. I mean, I once read a biography of JFK, and it talked about how, he was president of the United States, but if a 8-year-old asked him a question, he would, lean down so he was eye level and really focus on them as if they were the most important person in the world. And I mean, if the president of the United States can do that, then I can do that. So I try to set as a model, really focusing, put the phone away, like look them in the eyes and be focused on your family or your friends when you're with them, and be focused on work. I don't really phone in my work. I do pay a lot of attention. So that might be one big lesson that I want to impart to them. But I want to hear your insight. You said you had strong thoughts on this.
I have thoughts. Whether or not they are insightful, I don't know. But so you are talking about the importance of being really present and grounded and listening well. I think that's spot on. For me, I think the most important thing when it comes to learning and education is engagement. And I tell people all the time, I do think there are certain career paths. If you at age 18 know with certainty you want to be a physician, an architect, like there are certain jobs that if you know those are what you want, there probably is a technical path you should start pursuing sooner than later. But I think for most of us, what we study and what we end up doing professionally don't necessarily have to relate. And I personally think that the best, to your point, you said earlier, let's look at problems as puzzles. I think the most important skill we can all bring into the workplace is, being a good thinker. And so I think if you've taken a course of study that has really engaged your brain in whatever it is, I don't care, it could be drumming or Renaissance poetry or business. If you were engaged, if you cared enough to learn and think and question and explore whatever the topic, I think you're going to be successful. I think you will find a way to be successful. And so that's always my advice to parents or kids who are asking. Study something that really captivates you, and that's going to ready you to do whatever you choose to do someday.
That is great. I mean, they used to do some hand signal in elementary school when you agreed with something. So I can't remember what it was, but I'm doing that, whatever it is.
I'll take it. I will take your hand signal in the corner of the screen. Thank you.
100%. And thinking critically, I think, is the most important skill in business. And hopefully you can. And I think there are studies that talk about how liberal arts is actually good for. And I think you and I talked about at that college entry cocktail party, didn't we talk a little about that book Range, and how I at least am a fan of young people trying different areas to see what resonates with them. So not being locked into one.
Absolutely. I think we have a lot in common in how we think about this stuff. So AJ, before we close, is there anything that you want to call our attention to? Any projects of yours we should be keeping an eye out for? Any place you want to send people to find out more about you?
I guess one that I would plug is I have a Substack called Experimental Living with AJ Jacobs, and I'm excited about it because the premise of that is, I'm a writer, so I can do something for a year and write a book about it, but I realize most people have lives and they can't do that. But I'm a fan of small experiments, and even those can change your life in a big way. So even if it's just like, I'm going to commit to writing by hand for 10 minutes a day, that's an experiment that anyone can do. And it might have big benefits. It could be, I'm not going to gossip for a week and see what that's like. So I'm a big fan of experimenting, whether it's big experiments or small experiments. I just think it keeps your brain fresh. It keeps life fresh. And in the end, hopefully it improves your life.
Amazing. AJ, thank you so much for spending this time with me. I have enjoyed every minute of it.
Me too. And I was excited to, because I do like to, listen to the podcast that I'm on. And this was a joy to listen to. I learned so much, like I say. And so I hope at the end that I've accomplished that. Hopefully you listeners have found a couple of actual takeaways from this. If not, you can email me and complain. But I tried. Just know that I tried.
It was amazing. Thank you, AJ.
Thank you, Rachel.
I hope you enjoyed my conversation with AJ Jacobs. You can learn more about him, his work, his books at ajjacobs.com, or check out his podcast, The Puzzler, wherever you get your podcasts. It's short, it's quick, it's fun. And in the spirit of following curiosity, I'm curious about what you think of the show. So please leave a rating or review in your podcast app for the show. And if you'd like to connect one-on-one, even just to hit me with a question, reach out anytime at rachel@leadabovenoise.com. Join me next week for another great episode. Until then, visit my website, leadabovenoise.com. If your workplace could use an activation boost, whether it's a boot camp, a keynote, a pulse check, you choose. You can follow Modern Mentor on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. Thanks so much for listening and have a successful week. Modern Mentor is a quick and dirty tips podcast. It's audio engineered by Dan Feierbend. Our director of podcasts is Brandon Getchis. Our podcast and advertising operations specialist is Morgan Christensen. Our digital operations specialist is Holly Hutchings. Our marketing and publicity associate is Davina Tomlin. And our marketing contractor is Nathaniel Hoops.